So I'm going to talk about living a grace-filled life. That's our theme for our Journey of the Heart this year, and so I thought I'd start with that today. That Ernest Holmes teaches us that grace is the divine givingness of spirit, that God loves to give to God's creation, which would be all of us. And that, in fact, God is giving to us all the time. It's just that we're not always as open to receive as we like to pretend we are. But God's nature is to give of God's self to each and every one of us. Another definition of grace is unmerited favor. You know, you don't have to earn God's grace. It's given freely to all of God's children alike. And I love that. That just really touches me. You know, in the Old Testament, there are lots of stories that involve grace. There's grace in the story of Noah, and of course in the story of Abraham and Joseph that I'll talk about in a minute, and Moses and the Israelites and Rahab and David. And I think that all of those stories are pointing us to start to see how deeply each of us is loved by God. Now, let me say that God doesn't love us because of what we are. We are because God already loves us. The whole reason we exist is because God loved us into creation. Right? And so I think it's really important for us to grasp that, because when we know that we are loved, I think we're a little more open to receive the gift that God, or the gifts that God is always trying to give us. So Joseph in the Old Testament, this is a great story. This is Joseph of Amazing Technicolor Dream fame, okay, that Joseph. The Joseph was really despised by his brothers. He had a big family, and he was the youngest, and of course he was the favorite. In that way, the youngest is often the favorite. Do you know who I mean? Youngest? Yeah. Right? And so Joseph was really despised by his brothers, and what they did ultimately is they sold him into slavery. And then he was wrongly accused by the person he was a slave for, and was left to rot in prison. But he winds up working for the Egyptian Pharaoh. And it happens that Joseph is a phenomenal interpreter of dreams. And in the Old Testament, dreams are really important, and the ability to interpret dreams is a really powerful, important skill. And so word gets back to Pharaoh that, hey, this guy can interpret your dreams. He's really good. And so he interprets a dream that the Pharaoh's been having, and tells the Pharaoh basically that, you know, there's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. And what your dream means is that during the years of plenty, we need to store up so we're prepared for the famine. And that's exactly what the Pharaoh does. And the Pharaoh is so impressed, he puts Joseph in charge. He's like the number 2 man over all of Egypt. Well, word gets out that once the famine starts, and Joseph's brothers are getting hungry. So the father sends them, says, go see if you can buy corn from the Pharaoh. Now Joseph knows that this group, these guys are his brothers, but they don't recognize him. He's talking through an interpreter. And so he makes them jump through a few hoops. But eventually, he has the father and the family all move to Egypt where he can take care of them. So it's a great turn of events there. Now, looking at this story, and I've read this many times, it seemed to me that God used difficult and trying circumstances to position Joseph as a great person who would save his people. That is grace. Now, I believe we all have circumstances that we go through, that God can use those circumstances for a good that we cannot foresee, a good that we cannot even imagine, but we have to, 1, believe that that's possible, and 2, allow it to happen. You know what I mean? So I understand we're often faced with things that we don't like. And I believe what we have to say to ourselves is, I don't know how, but I believe that God can use this for good. Not only my good, but for the good of everyone involved. God can use this for good. So I'd read a story about this poor boy who in the old days used to go door to door selling goods to pay his way through school. And one day he realized he had only a dime in his pocket, and he was really hungry. And he was really giving up hope. He was like giving up his belief in God or humanity and all that. And he thought, well, I'll go to one more house and maybe I can barter with them and get some food. But he loses his nerve as he's knocking on the door, and he just asks for a glass of water. Well, the woman, instead of giving him a glass of water, she brings him a glass of milk. And he drinks the glass of milk really slowly, and he savors it because he's so, so hungry. And says, thank you so much. How much do I owe you? And she says, you don't owe me anything. We don't accept payment for a kindness. Right? And so the boy's faith in God and people was renewed. And this, like I said, this happened just as he was ready to completely give up on both. So speed ahead a number of years, that woman became critically ill. And she's sent to a big city where there's going to be a specialist to help possibly care for her very, very rare disease. Okay? So the physician hears the name of the woman, and he thinks, this is really interesting. He has a very strong feeling that this is the same woman who helped him years before. So he went and sees her, but he's in his, surgical garb, so she doesn't really recognize him. And he keeps doing every day the very best he can to help her. He is on a mission to save her life. And so after a long struggle, in fact, the battle was won, and she's cured. And so he tells the billing department, send the bill to me first before you give it to her. And when he sees the bill, which she is terrified of receiving because she knows it's going to take her the rest of her life to pay off this huge medical bill, we understand. He writes on her bill, paid in full with 1 glass of milk. And he signed the bill and gave it to the woman, and of course she was just overwhelmed. So the last little thing about grace that I want to share with us was in the 1700s, there was a man named John Newton. You know who I'm talking about. He's the man who penned the song, or the lyrics to the song, Amazing Grace. Now, he was not a good guy. Okay, I've just got to say it. He was not a good guy. He was a sailor. He was a slave trader. He'd been on a ship since he was 11 years old. He was coarse. He led a debauched life. He was rude. He even made other sailors blush, so they say. He was that bad. And so the ship he was on at this time was the Greyhound, and it's in the North Atlantic above Ireland. And they're in this horrible storm for well over a week. The sails had all been ripped to shreds. The boat is tremendously damaged, the ship, and there's little hope for he and the crew to survive. Now, he's so tired because he's been up for days. What he does is he actually lashes himself to the helm to try and hold the ship on course. And he does this from 1 p.m. till midnight. So for 11 hours, he is tied to the helm trying to hold the ship on course. And miraculously, they make it through the night. And so in 1748, he wrote, "On that day the Lord sent from on high and delivered me out of deep waters." So at 39 years old, he gets sick, and then he can't be a slave trader anymore or be on the ships. And so he begins 43 years of preaching at 39 years of age. And so this song that we often sing here at church, Amazing Grace, is a song of Newton's gratitude to God for turning him from what was essentially what he said was a wicked life to eventually fight against the ills that he actually practiced. Now, one of the things that he did when he became a preacher is he wrote a pamphlet against slavery, which a good friend of his used and gave to everyone in the British Parliament. And it was a contributing factor that Britain would eventually outlaw slavery. And Newton had something to do with it. So he went from being the guy who was profiting from slavery to doing a complete 180 and influencing Great Britain's Parliament to abolish slavery. Now, Newton never ceased to stand in awe of God's work in his life. So my point about these stories is that, we all experience really difficult stuff again and again and again. If you think because you're spiritually inclined that nothing bad will ever happen, allow me to heal you of that belief right now, okay? Because stuff, and we'll just leave it at stuff, happens, okay? We don't believe in a punishing God, but there are consequences in the universe. There are things that we perhaps will never fully be able to explain until some later date when we have a level of enlightenment that really, really sees clearly all things. But I do believe that since God is always trying to give to us, and that anything, absolutely anything, can be used for greater good, if we believe that and if we will allow it, then I believe that grace can be more active in all of our lives. I don't think it would be such a bad thing in our life to feel like we are right now having a tremendous influx of grace in our life, whatever our current circumstances look like. You know that good can come from this if we will let it. So again, I'm asking you to think about the place the church has in your life, the importance we may have for you, and I hope that you will join us in making a commitment to the church for the year ahead so that we can come up with a spending plan and we know what we're going to do. Let's pray. So we turn our attention inward now for a moment to just remember that we are surrounded and filled with God's Spirit, that the very presence of the living God, the God that is love and intelligence, that's everywhere, is right where we are. That God within us is the most true, most real thing about each and every one of us, and I believe with all my heart this day that God in us is greater than any circumstance or condition we might face in the world. And so we rest in that awareness right here, right now, that God in me is greater than this, whatever I'm facing. Accept that for yourself now. And we include in our prayer our family members and our friends and loved ones, wherever they may be. We remind ourselves that God surrounds them and fills them, and God is the very truth of their being. We let our prayer be a blessing in the world around us where there is so much going on that it would be easy to give in to the negativity and the fear, but we're not going to do that. As people who believe in God, we're going to say the God we believe in is greater than all of that. So I claim for each and every one of us a deep, powerful awareness of God's presence permeating all those things taking place in the world around us. We bless our church. We bless all churches. We bless synagogues and temples and mosques and ashrams, all paths to God. Because I know that we are all connected on the unseen side of life. In the mind and in the heart of God, we are all one. And so with a full heart, I give thanks for this. I give thanks in advance for healing taking place. We stand as open, willing vessels for God's love and light to come into the world. And so with a full heart, I just release this word, and so it is. Together we all say, Amen.